The prophet Ezekiel had a vision. It was a vision of the end, of cataclysmic, sometimes horrifying things that would happen when history was drawing to a close. We call this apocalyptic literature because it's a revelation of what was going to happen. The New Testament's version of that, the book of Revelation, similarly has visions of great violence and terror, and it echoes one of the beasts seen in the book of Ezekiel. There is in Ezekiel an image of a beast with 4 faces. Those faces of a lion, of a human, of an ox, and of an eagle are picked up again by Revelation to say, this is where we are headed. This is what history has in store for us. Pay attention. Some generations after the New Testament was completed, there began a tradition of assigning to each of the 4 gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, one of the 4 faces from the beast mentioned in Ezekiel and echoed in the book of Revelation. There has never entirely been agreement as to which of the 4 faces might be applied to the 4 evangelists, but here's our take. In assigning the 4 figures to each of the Gospels, I'm thinking of their Christology, how it is they present the person of Jesus Christ. For 100 years, scholars have agreed that Mark was the first gospel written. Matthew is listed first in our New Testament because it does such a good job of tying the Old Testament to the New Testament. Matthew makes more use of Scripture than do any of the other evangelists, and so we give Matthew the Lion. The Lion of Judah is a good way of thinking about the Jesus the Christ that Matthew speaks of, forever tied to what Scripture has shown us already, but in a courageous new way fulfilling that Scripture. Matthew. Mark has what we might call the lowest Christology of the Gospel writers. In Mark, Jesus is presented as a human being full of God's power, but also more limited than in the other Gospels. More on that in a moment. In Mark, Jesus is presented as a man who is tragically caught up in the politics of the day, who is tragically cut short in his prime and crucified. And resurrection itself is presented in Mark as an unknown question, an unfulfilled possibility that the reader must live into. Mark gets the human being. Regarding the second 2 Gospels, the agreement is much greater in who gets what figure. Luke, because of his interest in work, in politics, and the nitty-gritty of getting down into the ground, gets the ox. John, whose Christology is the highest of the Gospels, seems to see history from a high vantage point. Jesus is exalted. Jesus, even on the cross, is in control of the situation, not so much in the Synoptic Gospels. We might also think of the Gospels as how they differ in their literary approach. Matthew is preoccupied with historical, looking backwards and what has happened before, what has been fulfilled before, what has been written before. That is how we're going to understand what is going in Jesus Christ. Mark's Gospel is the elevator speech, the shortest by far of all the Gospels. Mark, at 16 chapters, uses the word immediately more than any of the other writers and seems to be in a hurry to get to the conclusion. Mark is the short version, succinct. The work that Luke wants us to do is political. Luke is preoccupied with the underclass, the oppressed, the workers in the field, the women around us. Luke's is the most political of the Gospels. Social justice matters. The first 3 Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be seen with the same eye, and so the story they tell is much more similar than the Gospel of John. John's is much more metaphoric and poetic. When we read through the Gospel and find it somewhat redundant, it's often because these Synoptic Gospels have presented the same story in only slightly different ways. When we read through the Gospels and find something very profound and deep and a little bit odd, chances are we're in John. Besides the faces of the beasts and the literary approach of each of the Gospels, another way we might understand their differences is thinking therapeutically. When we go into therapy, when we talk to a friend about what's going on in our lives, there are at least 4 different questions we have in mind. Matthew, again, is preoccupied with background. When you're learning about yourself, you want to know about your family of origins, where you came from. You want to know the backstory of how we got where we are. Mark presents the gospel as current crisis. This is what's going on right now. And any good counselor, any good friend is going to ask you across that coffee table, why are we here today? What's going on with you right now? Luke might be considered the intervention. Luke is the point in the conversation where your friend turns to you and say, okay, I've heard all the horrible stuff your parents did. I understand why we're here today. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Where are you going to intervene? Luke is where we say, what's the practical, political approach to what's happening? Do we need an intervention? We're going to go talk to somebody. What behavior are we changing? John, with his eagle's eye view, takes a big view, the long term, to say, look, what happens next is up to you. You're going to do something practical, but also let's remember, this story is your story. You get to write it. It's about your journey. Lastly, we might look at the four Gospels and their different approach to time. If Matthew is preoccupied with yesterday and how we got here, if Mark is the elevator speech utterly wrapped up in today and right now, then Luke looks at tomorrow. How can you and I change things now to get to a better tomorrow? And John has the biggest view, the eagle-eye view imaginable of eternity. In the grand scheme of things is often where we find our way to peace. Looking at the gospel writers through this lens of four different aspects isn't necessarily biblical. It's not tied to any specific biblical tradition. I find it helpful to do, however, because it reminds us of their strengths, their differences, even as those four gospels are the gospel that we take in. We teach this at Genesis with a little bit of fun, and not just because we're doing an academic exercise and looking at differences of the Gospels, but because there's a message here for all of us. Learning about the gospel differences, we also learn about ourselves. Growing into the four approaches is a reminder that we're not called just to study, to read, to know the Bible. We're called also to be evangelists, to bring our own message, our own version of faith and what's been going on in the past, where we are now, what our plans for politically in the future, and also where we believe God is taking all of creation. We are all called to be evangelists. When someone asks you about your own faith, your own philosophy, your own view of what's going on in the world, that's a deep moment and a question. You're obligated, I believe, tie your comments back to the path. Be Matthean. Be the one who knows where we have been, where that person has been, where your own faith structure has been before. Put it in a historical context. That's how to feel comfortable with where the conversation is going. Continuity matters. Secondly, be Markan. Be short and succinct. They're not asking for a thesis. I guarantee you what they want is an elevator speech, your response to what is true now. Thirdly, politics matter. If you're a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, if you're just a person of integrity, you have a political viewpoint that counts. You should be able to put it into play. Tell someone what your values are, how it relates right now to the issues surrounding us. And finally, be like John. Be poetic. Take a chance. Take your back tradition, everything you know about faith, and make it your own, your version of what is, what God is about, what existence is about, should not sound like anybody else's if you're being an adult. Take a chance. Be a bit of a poet. In so doing, I believe we do honor and justice to the evangelists, to this rich tradition we have inherited that we're supposed to be embodying, that the world desperately needs.